in the spirit of culturati and with an abundance of gratitude to Eugene and to the whole team that made it possible for me to be with you today, I thought I might present something. I mean, this is a very dark subject, right? About how the Ukraine crisis is going to cause global hunger. And there's no way really of sugaring this presentation in any way other than to offer a sort of sideshow if you're interested. This presentation is brought to you by the letter C. And so if you are interested and just want to score points, see if you can spot how many times the letter C is responsible for the mess that we're in today. I'll give you an easy one right now. I mean, humans are capable of eating 7,000 plants, but unfortunately, about 50% of the plants that we eat are really just about 3 cereals, and that's corn, wheat and rice, and the fact that our diets are so dominated by just a few things means that our food system is already inherently fragile because of the way that we treat these cereals as commodities. Now, the fragility of the food system is not an accident. The food system has been designed this way, and it generates a whole lot of externalities. The Rockefeller Foundation last year put out a report observing that in 2019, we spent about $1.1 trillion on food here in the United States. But if you look at the mess that this food system creates in terms of healthcare costs, in terms of environmental destruction, in terms of underpaying workers and the depression that comes from that, there's a range of factors from biological to physical to the economic costs. And the Rockefeller Foundation sort of quantified this using some methodology developed by McKinsey that suggested that actually the externalities generated by the food system are about $2.1 trillion. So we spend $1.1 trillion, but the damage caused by our food system is $2.1 trillion that are not included in the price. And these externalities are not a bug in the food system, they're a feature. So, we're busy generating externalities in the food system that means that the total cost of our food system is $3.2 trillion, but we only pay $1.1 trillion for it. So the food system itself is inherently fragile and it's generating all kinds of trouble. But is it, at the very least, generating food? More bad news, I'm afraid. No. Historically, and I'm going to go large here, so you can see this this data here. But we have reached the best that humanity has been able to do in terms of reducing hunger. We did that in 2014, when merely 6.6 or 6.7 million people were undernourished. Now, undernourished means that you are lacking 2,100 calories per person per day over the course of an entire year. So every day that year, there were more than 600 million people who had less than 2,100 calories a day. And as a proportion of humanity, that figure has been sort of stable around 8.3% until 2019, when it started getting worse. And then, of course, we had COVID. Another C for you playing along at home. COVID made hunger catastrophically worse. And that's not because yields went down or there was any less food in the world. The reason that things got worse is because hunger is not about an absence of food. It's about an absence of an ability to be able to afford that food. And so because of global recessions, we saw figures of people going hungry soar. This is the 2020 data. It's the latest we have available. Some early statistics from the USDA suggest that number is just going up in 2021. The number of hungry people is likely to be higher than the median here, which is 768 million people, or around 9.9% of all humans going hungry. So on top of this very bad situation, we've now got this conflict. And conflict isn't great for hunger. I mean, before Ukraine, there have been conflicts around the world, and it's quite right to observe that the coverage of the story in Ukraine has always been a little bit sort of disproportionate, given that there are so many other conflicts happening in the world that involve people of color. And it's just important to observe that there is that sort of racial bias in the way that this has all been covered in the media in the United States. But we do know that conflict makes hunger worse, not just for those involved locally, but because of the sort of complex political economics of this particular situation, this is going to be much worse globally. And the reason I know that, and the reason everyone knows that, is because we've got data from the last few food price spikes. Now, the story I'm going to tell you is a story about how the conflict in Ukraine is going to have global ramifications because Ukraine and Russia are so important, not only in supplying wheat, but also in terms of supplying fertilizer globally. And wheat is the sort of the cereal that's most important in our story here today. Here's something to just give you a sense of how bad things are likely to get. This is just a sort of overview of the wheat prices, and you can see the wheat prices in red here. And there have been various spikes, particularly in 2008 and 2010, in part because of the global recession in 2008, and again because of a global economic turmoil in 2010. And the consequence of that was a huge explosion in unrest, in food rebellions. In 2008, we saw governments change in Haiti, among other places. And of course, 2010 inaugurated the Arab Spring, all associated with spikes in the price of wheat. And if you look at the price of wheat now, you'll see that it is spiking once again. And rebellions are a certainty as a result. There's nothing about the current situation that suggests that we won't have unrest as a result. And if you look back in history, you'll see that spikes in the price of wheat were made worse by inflation in other foods and in the price of fuel. And that's what it's like today. Now, to give you a sense of how this is going to unfold and how dark this is, let's do a little bit of history. Let's go back to 2010. In 2010, we had some of these global food price spikes. And there's a story that I want to tell you that's about some of these food price spikes and Russia. Now, you may not have necessarily caught this in 2010, but there was a wobble in the atmosphere. Now, so some of this data is just coming through now, but climate change was involved in a wobble in the jet stream. Now, as a result of that wobble in the jet stream, a couple of things happened. In Pakistan, there were unseasonable floods, and a third of Pakistan was flooded in 2010. That didn't make the front page of the newspaper, but there was something else that did, and it happened on the other side of the jet stream, and it was a massive heat dome in Russia in August 2010. And that heat dome caused epic fires, particularly in the food-producing regions of Russia. And I mean, you can see the results from space here. I mean, there were vast wildfires, and the heat dome settled over Russia. And in some of the data here, you can see, look, it was incredibly hot, in the 40s Celsius, so we're way into the hundreds. And as a result, mainly of the smoke from the wildfires, not just the heat, but the smoke in particular, 55,000 people were estimated to have died as a result of that heat dome. Now, that you may say, well, this is just a story about the weather. But climate change isn't just about the weather. It's also about human interactions with the climate. And in Russia, there's a story that's worth observing that predates the advent of Russia. This is a story about the advent of capitalism in Russia. Now, in the Soviet Union, the way that grain was produced in some of the grain-producing belts of Russia was fairly tightly regulated. The Soviet Union understood the wisdom that peasants before the creation of the Soviet Union understood, that if you're growing a couple of crop cycles a year, you're going to be able to allow the soil to recharge a certain amount of the water that you're draining out of it with your crops. But if you don't allow your crop rotation to let the soil recharge, if you don't have fallow periods built into your agricultural cycle, then the water in the soil will be drained out by your crops. Now, the Soviet Union was there busy regulating that. And of course, After the Soviet Union, things changed rather dramatically. And it's important to remember that the United States had a hand in it. If you want the sort of Cliff Notes version, I really like this article. The Harvard Boys Do Russia. It's in the Nation magazine, and it's absolutely fantastic. Google it, you will enjoy it, and you'll see lots of familiar names there. You'll see names like Jeffrey Sachs, a man who's since invented himself as the economist for Bono, and you'll see, Larry Summers, for example, as folk who went in and allowed the privatization of certain kinds of Russian assets and gave us the oligarchs that we have today and the sort of political situation that to which we can trace the current situation in Russia. But one of the other things specifically about food is that all of a sudden these restrictions on what could be used in the soil, what could be grown and how often you could grow, all of a sudden, all of that was out the window. And that meant that farmers started planting not just 2 cycles, but 3, 4 cycles of crops every year. And now what that did was drain the moisture out of the soil, entirely predictably. But the consequence of that, and I won't suffer you to really sort of dig into this graph because time's running short. But suffice to say that areas where where farmers had really drained the water out of the soil, had really been very profitable farms, very successful farmers. But those areas where crop rotations had been successive and the soil was dry, those areas were 13 times more likely to have heat spikes. So again, the climate was made worse by the interaction with farming habits that were unleashed by the advent of capitalism in Russia. Now, this was all made worse by some other folk, some other capitalists who were, and you may know the firm Glencore, set up by Mark Richards after he ran away from the United States, accused of various crimes. He parked up in Switzerland, and Glencore, based out of Zurich, had a grain trading arm. Now, earlier on in 2010, the traders had made various bets about the grain that they were going to be able to ship from Russia. And all of a sudden, with the grain price spiking and with the fires burning in Russia, those grain traders looked like they would be seriously out of money. And so in August 2010, the grain traders in Russia made an open call. Glencore made an open call saying, look, Russia, you need to impose a grain export ban, because that way you will be certain to be able to feed your people here in Russia. Yes, of course, there'll be a grain price spike, but you don't have to worry your pretty little heads about that, Russia, because at least there will be grain for you. Now, Glencore's motive in this was, of course, because if Russia did declare an export ban, all of a sudden, the traders would be able to declare force majeure. They would be able to get out of their grain contracts because, if Russia suddenly changed the terms of the game, the contracts were built so that the grain traders could walk away without having to lose their shirts, paying way over their strike price for grain that would come from Russia. 2 days after making this demand of Russia, Russia imposed a wheat export ban. And for certain traders at Glencore, they were able to walk away from their contracts, and some of those traders lived happily ever after, although other bits of Glencore, of course, and the rest of the world suffered. Let's talk about the rest of the world for a second. And in fact, let's talk about this place. Let's talk about Mozambique, a place very far away from Russia, but a place that was that felt really very deeply the effects of the wheat export ban. Now you may think, well, hang on. Mozambique isn't near a grain belt. Wheat doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that naturally grows in Mozambique. And you'd be entirely right, except for the fact that there has been historically a taste for bread in Mozambique because of Portuguese colonialism. The Portuguese hadn't colonized and created the area that we now call Mozambique, then it wouldn't be normal for people to want everyday bread on their table. But the fact is that Portugal did colonize Mozambique, and the taste for bread was inculcated in everyone. And it just becomes one of these things where your dignity as a homemaker, as a working person, rests on having your daily bread. So there were queues for bread in Mozambique as a result of the grain price spike that happened when Russia imposed its export ban. And Russia was doing, Mozambique was doing pretty badly anyway, because it was a very indebted country. Interest rates, the mode of governance there was one of austerity. So, as you'll remember from 2008 and 2010, governments across the world tightened their belts, driven by, Larry Summers again. And the tightening of belts meant that food got more expensive in Mozambique, fuel got more expensive, and budgets for things like policing were cut. And the police in Mozambique found that they didn't have the budget for rubber bullets. And so in Maputo, in the capital of Mozambique, and in other places, when the rubber bullets ran out, the government and the police force switched to live ammunition. And as a result, dozens of people, including children, were killed in these bread protests, in these food rebellions. Now, that in and of itself is the story of what happened in 2010. An area where, an era when the international governance and heavy debt and increasing food prices meant that austerity was wreaked on countries in the global south. And that's not really different from where we are now. And it's possibly worse because right now, interest rates are going up. I mean, at least in 2008 to 2010, interest rates were pretty low, but we're seeing them go up. And countries around the world are having to make the painful choice of either repaying their creditors or feeding their people. And we've already seen one change of government in Sri Lanka as a result of some fairly catastrophically stupid economic policy there. But the grain story today is going to be much, much worse. Let me show you why. Now, this isn't something I expect you to be able to read, but the important and salient bit here is that you've got the blue and the orange here showing the extent of food, of wheat being imported in a range of different countries, the names of which you can't see, don't worry about that, coming from Russia in blue and Ukraine in orange. And you can see that there are quite a lot of countries that get 100% of their grain from, or close to, from the combination of Russia and Ukraine. And we're in a situation where those exports are becoming increasingly expensive and where Russian and Ukrainian grain is increasingly not available, in part because Russia has gone out of its way to do things like mine fields in Ukraine. But we're seeing also just speculation on the price of wheat, and that's driving up the cost globally. And so you may think, well, all right, perhaps there's some flexibility here. Maybe we can have more being exported from other countries. Let's have a look at this. So we've got the Russian Federation. These are figures around the world's wheat exporters in 2019, I believe, is the year this comes from. But the Russian Federation was the largest, and the US and Canada were next. Now, and then Ukraine was after that. So we've seen that Russia and Ukraine, well, their grain exports are significantly curtailed. The problem with us in Canada and the United States is that there hasn't really been a huge supply response. And that's because of another feature of where we find ourselves, which is that Russia is an exporter of fertilizer. And in particular, it's one of the top 10 exporters of nitrogen fertilizer, which is vital if we're going to be able to have the kinds of monoculture of wheat produced at levels that we're used to. Now, if the price of the price of fertilizer is going up as it is, then you won't see a strong supply response. And in fact, earlier on this year, only 40% of Canadian wheat farmers said that they were going to plant more. And that's not nearly enough to make up the shortfall. So you might think, all right, well, maybe we can turn to some of these other producers, like France, for example. The problem is France right now is undergoing a heat wave. And heat waves aren't great in the early stages of wheat production. And right now, of course, the spring planting's in the ground, and wheat isn't thriving. So then we might think, all right, well, if not France, maybe maybe some of these other places, maybe India. I mean, India up here is not a huge producer of wheat, but maybe India can help out a little bit. And that would be great, because India, we want Indian wheat production to thrive, not least because India is one of the world's largest consumers of wheat. And here's where things start to get even darker, because right now, India is under a catastrophic heat wave. And temperatures right now, again, as India is in the planting season, suggests that Indian wheat stocks and Indian wheat production may be hit by as much as a 25% decline. So that's not nearly enough, not only to export, but India will maybe this year become a net wheat importer. So all of this suggests that we are certainly on track to have less wheat in the global economy than in 2019, possibly 2018. There's the data I've seen from the USDA just today. All of this, coupled with rising interest rates, particularly in countries in the global south, plus spikes in fuel prices, leads to the potent combination that will almost guarantee, and in fact, I'll put money down now, we will see more rebellions of the kind that we've already seen in Sri Lanka, and it's just a matter of time for that to happen. So what can I offer you? I mean, first of all, maybe a summary of what I've been just saying, and for those of you keeping track at home, here's where you get to see your scores. First of all, this has been a story about climate change. It's also been a story about hunger under COVID. I mean, things were bad enough under COVID, and COVID is not going away, much as we would like to pretend that this sort of short diminuendo we find ourselves in is in fact a finale. It's not. COVID's going to be around for a while, as is conflict. Even if the story in Ukraine ends happily ever after tomorrow, and it's increasingly unlikely that that's the case, there are still going to be pretty difficult supply chain issues that plague Ukrainian wheat production for some time to come. And of course, this is a story about colonialism. It's a story about how these supply chains are old, and the demands that exist around the world have been shaped by colonialism. Again, think to Portugal and its colonization of Mozambique, but also just think to the history of the food system. The history of the food system is a history of colonialism. This is also a story about chemistry. The industrial agricultural machine requires not just nitrogen, but potassium and phosphorus. And Russia is a major exporter of all of those. And our chemical agricultural system is generating vast externalities. And we are hostage to a certain kind of industrial chemistry if we are to sort of stick to the three cereals that we are bound to. But of course, that's capitalism at work. We treat food not as a necessity for everyone to be able to eat, but as a means to make money. And if that's the case, then we will structurally always have hunger. And unless we change our ways of thinking about food and hunger, then it is not clear that the celebrants of industrial agriculture have anything to point to other than a date in 2016 when things looked like they might be okay. But for the rest of this decade, at least, it looks like we will have more than 600 million people in hunger. And that's the sort of the hard part for me here, is that we're in a moment of craven stupidity. That we're doubling down on industrial agriculture. We're doubling down on all the mistakes and all the opportunities that we had to learn from the errors of the past. And this is what sort of frustrates me. I mean, I've got ideas about how to change the food system. I mean, I could tell you we should decarbonize. We should move away from industrial agriculture. And there are really good scientifically proven ways of making the food system better in terms of its carbon sequestration, in terms of its response to climate change. We can sequester so much carbon in the soil if we abandon this sort of monoculture of farming. We also need to recognize that the people who are in the driver's seat of keeping us where we are right now are monopolies. There's a sort of ABCD of of agricultural enterprises. Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, and Dreyfus, some of the largest agricultural conglomerates on the face of the earth. They're doing very well out of out of this particular grain crisis. Look at their share prices for the two that are publicly listed. But getting rid of these monopolies makes it easier for us to break away from the forces that lobby for us to stay exactly on this track. I mean, I could talk to you about debt relief, about how it is that actually, if we stop extracting value from countries in the global south and instead make reparations for all that we've taken from them, we might actually help these countries feed their people. And we should diversify our food systems. 3 grains for 50% of humanity isn't structurally very wise. Ask any portfolio manager whether betting on 3 things or betting on 7,000 in a time of increasing uncertainty is wise, and you'll have your answer. And ultimately, of course, what we need to do is reverse this sort of long history of supply chain colonialism. I've got answers, but the problem is, and this is a question I leave with you, how is it that in this moment, when we know and we have so much evidence from farmers around the world, 8 million farmer groups around the world are experimenting with some of these decarbonized local economies that are actually doing much better for farmers, their families, and their communities, and doing much better for the environment. But we've got the evidence. But why is it that our policymakers insist on doubling down on renewable fuel mandates and the sort of structures of industrial agriculture? Well, in part that's capitalism, but it's also a cultural issue. And how it is that we embrace the need for the kinds of radical transformation that we need if we want to end hunger globally. If we're going to move away from the kinds of catastrophe that war in one part of the world can meet on all of us, well, that is perhaps one of the biggest cultural questions we face in our lives. And I can't think of a better place to begin to address it than at Culturati. So thanks very much for your attention. And if you're interested in any of these references, of course, these slides and the references associated with them will be with Eugene and with the rest of the team. But for now, I'm just very grateful for your attention. Thanks so much for joining me today.